Guess what? It's time once again for something to talk about at the Senior Community Center. And our programs are sponsored by Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island. To learn about their memory care, independent living, and assisted living units up on Rolling Bay, call them 360-594-1010. Also, we make a special point of acknowledging that we are meeting on the ancestral homelands of the Suquamish people, the people of the clear salt water, who have been taking care of the land and waters of the Salish Sea since time immemorial, and we honor them and are grateful for their hospitality. Today, we're going to be talking about Indigenous Peoples Day, which not so long ago people called Columbus Day, but maybe Indigenous Peoples Day is a better name for a holiday in October. And to help us think about the ways that we can mark it and celebrate it, and Lovejoy with our who helps with all our idea, inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility programming, is here once again with us. Yeah.
Thanks, Reed. Yeah, actually, some people think that the A stands for annoying because so many of these things make us think about stuff that might feel a little uncomfortable at times. But being annoyed can turn us into being an activist. There's another A for you. So idea can end in all kinds of interesting ways. Um, Next Monday, the Senior Center is going to be closed as we observe Indigenous Peoples Day, which was again this year declared a federal holiday by President Biden. Um, if you're not sure what this day is all about, join the party. It turns out it's a really long story because Indigenous Peoples Day has pretty deep roots. As far as I know, it goes back at least to that International Conference on Discrimination Against Indigenous Populations in the Americas, which the UN put on in the 70s. I don't know if any of you remember that. But back then, the liberation theology was really building in South and Central America and changing a lot of the culture, because the church culture had been so strong. But liberation theology, instead of teaching kind of the caste system, essentially started talking about human rights in a whole different way. And that created this big groundswell of action and movement and thought in all the Americas, right? So at that point, at that conference, speakers from all over the world met, and it was pretty amazing because a great many of them proposed replacing the United States Columbus Day with some form of Indigenous Peoples Day, um, to honor the displaced original people of forcibly colonized lands. That conversation had not really been popularized until that point. Columbus Day, we all have probably grew up with the myths about it, but essentially it really honors a mercenary explorer who directly and indirectly caused enormous harm to Native people wherever he went. Um, that that idea created a lot of basically a little firestorm in the Italian American community, because of course they had been greatly proud of Christopher Columbus and had the Columbus medals and all that kind of stuff. But now what started to happen was the whole civil rights movement was kind of bubbling up. And the year after that conference, the Native American group staged a protest in Boston at Thanksgiving, which I remember because it was really dramatic. In Massachusetts, right? A holiday, Thanksgiving was considered to be a time to honor that friendly collaboration between Native people and early colonists. And as a school child growing up in Massachusetts, I learned these lovely stories about how the kind Native people greeted the colonists warmly and helped them with food and shelter. But so many other people, I did not learn the darker side of that story about land grab and genocide until I was in college. Anyway, that initial Boston protest sparked a lot of similar social justice efforts in other cities and even other countries. So it really was kind of the landmark event in the United States that started people really thinking and talking about is uh, is Columbus Day an appropriate holiday for us, right? So that growing worldwide social justice movement led to the first Continental Conference on 500 Years of Indian Resistance. I don't know if any of you remember that. I think it was in 1990 or late 80s in Ecuador. And again, representatives of Indigenous people throughout the Americas got together and they decided to use 1992 as the 500th anniversary of Columbus's voyages to start staging events and programs that emphasized continental unity and liberation as new themes to replace whitewashed colonialist narratives. I mean, many of you have heard some of our wonderful recordings made by Suquamish tribal historian and elder Barbara Lawrence, and she has often noted that the arrival of colonial powers was never really good news for any Indigenous people anywhere, right? And so in the United States, that movement to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day became part of the civil rights movement as American Indians created the Red Power movement, remember that, in response to or solidarity with kind of the Black Power movement. And it was really the first time that American Indian people were politically visible in a society where issues of race and racial equality were starting to really gain impact and attention. I kind of really remember this because I happened to be out of the country for some of those years. And when I came back, it was amazing. People were doing all these power symbols and I didn't know what they were doing. And there was Black power and queer power and women's power and all kinds of interesting things were going on. And I thought, this is awesome, right? There's a lot of change. But of course, change is uncomfortable and change also gets a lot of pushback. So not surprising, it was not a smooth process. But here is a surprise, or something I was surprised anyway. What would you guess would be the first state to recognize Indigenous people? Anybody? I mean, I'll just start it off by saying I thought it was California, but no. What would you think?
I don't know, Massachusetts?
Yeah, that would be a good guess too. But it turns out it was South Dakota, which is less surprising when you think about it. South Dakota has this huge, very visible Native population, and it became the very first state to celebrate and make part of their state culture Indigenous Peoples Day, because the American Indian rights movement was really blossoming in the late 1880s, and that's when South Dakota was really stepping up, which I really missed that. I didn't really think of South Dakota as being an activist outpost, right? And of course, next was what I thought of the California Bay Area Indian Alliance. Now, I don't know if you remember that, but they did develop that Resistance 500 task force and opening conversations about all the ways in which Columbus's discovery of uninhabited lands and the subsequent European colonization of them caused the genocide of thousands, if not millions, of Indigenous people, really through decisions that were made by colonial and national governments, violent acts of governments and colonists who believed that Indigenous land was free for the taking and Indigenous people had no rights. Some people actually believed they weren't really people. I've actually heard people say that to this very day. But that year, of course, Berkeley voted to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, and that kind of started a movement, and a bunch of places took it on from there. I think part of the thing that started to happen was more contemporary history started showing parts about Columbus and Columbus's story. And the more that happened, the less it seemed appropriate to honor his basically deadly legacy, right? I don't know if all of you remember when those first books were coming out, how the impact they had was pretty major. And a lot of people do, we don't like to have our dreams shattered or our myths debunked. And so that caused quite a stir. Today, there's at least 12 states that do not celebrate Columbus Day, which is kind of interesting. And however, that movement has pushed back too, because like in California formally recognized Indigenous Peoples Day, but the holiday was eliminated by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger during the 2008 recession for budgetary reasons, which kind of points out the vulnerability of such events to political manipulation, which, as we know, is extremely possible to this day, right? To avoid that, the Biden administration proclaimed Indigenous Peoples Day a federal holiday last year and again this year. And now there's two bills in Congress, one each in the House and the Senate, that propose to make it permanent, but that hasn't yet been voted into law. And it remains to be seen whether it does or not. So interestingly, I kind of thought, okay, so does Indigenous Peoples Day replace Columbus Day? It does not. Columbus Day remains a federal holiday, but under the Biden administration, it's also federally recognized that same day as Indigenous Peoples Day. There's 11 federal holidays. There's always some pushback about adding any. There was a movement some years ago to try to add Native American Peoples Day to Thanksgiving to kind of overlap, because Thanksgiving is another one of those holidays that has a pretty sketchy background in terms of thanking God for removing all those pesky Indians and making this country available to us, which, is a narrative that is not really as popular today as it was several hundred years ago. Um, but I was really intrigued to find that if you look up federal holidays, there's a lot of different lists and they're different, which cracked me up. Some of them have Indigenous Peoples Day and Columbus Day. Some have one or the other. Some people have Native American Heritage Day and not Thanksgiving. Others leave that out. Um, Washington State observes both Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day, largely thanks to support from several activist groups. I don't know if you remember that in like 2014, I think the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians and Seattle's Human Rights Commission both really put up a lot of, uh, I guess, political pressure to see that happen. And it did, which I think is great. I don't know. Does anyone remember some of that stuff? Sometimes when you're busy in life and things don't really click that much, I found myself looking at some of this history and going, oh, yeah, I kind of remember that. But it didn't always strike me as a big deal at the time. But I see that, it kind of was.
Things that seem obvious today were obviously not.
Right. That's the thing that's fascinating to me is when you look back in the civil rights movement of any aspect of that, social justice movements, so many of these things that now we say, well, yeah, um, were not obvious and were not even common conversations. So it makes me kind of wonder what else is on the horizon, um, right? What are we going to look back at in 10 or 20 years and go, oh, I never even thought of that one, right? But there's so much blooming of, it's almost like the pressure cooker of like all this pushback creates more forward momentum in some ways too. So we're seeing more uh, appropriate forward movement, and as well as that kind of strange pushback, right?
Yeah, well, and I think that maybe there will become a point, I'm pretty sure, where Columbus Day will not be observed. But the idea of fighting to remove it is kind of not worth the effort. It's better to just kind of move forward and celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day and that heritage, and let the fight sort of go out of Columbus Day.
Well, you got to pick your battles, don't you? I mean, that's one of the things I think a lot of activists are figuring out. Like, you can't fight over every single thing. And some things like that seem to have enough momentum that they're probably inevitably going to be changed doesn't need to be pushed really hard, whereas other things could use a push, right? And I
Well,
think
like for
Indigenous
like for
peoples.
example, the idea of marking Indigenous Peoples Day. Now that's worth, trying to get those states that don't. Did you say there were some that don't observe it yet?
Yeah, many don't observe it yet. In fact, I think only a dozen or so do. That's the interesting part, and that's why Biden administration felt like they wanted to really um, make that a pretty big deal, because it's one of those things. This A dozen states do not celebrate Columbus Day, and it's interesting. It's Alaska. Okay, that makes sense. Hawaii probably makes sense. Iowa, hmm, Louisiana, Maine, Michigan, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oregon, South Dakota, Vermont, Wisconsin, and Washington, D.C. Now, to me, that's kind of politically all over the place. That's really an interesting bunch. But what that says is that the indigenous people in those states have put on enough pressure, made enough noise that they're getting a pretty good response, which I think is great. In other cases, like California, having Schwarzenegger decide that it was too expensive to have a holiday that celebrated uh, indigenous people, that's probably going to happen in some places too. But, one of the things I've been thinking about is observing it as an opportunity instead of, when I grew up, all of the holidays were basically party time. Nobody in my family sat down and had a moment or, a big conversation about what the meaning of these. We sometimes got some of it at school, but not always really. Or when we did get conversations about it, they were often fairy tales. So giving ourselves the kind of a chance to sit down and really think about what do we know about some of these holidays and what do we What's the story, our internalized narrative about it? What are the stories we tell ourselves about our nation, right? Columbus Day supports the story of a nation created by Europeans for Europeans, which is the one many of us grew up with, right? Brave pioneers going where no one had ever been before. Oh, who are those people? Just cast of thousands. Don't worry about them, right? But Indigenous Peoples Day gives us a chance to kind of reflect on Native histories and Native people and consider what it might truly mean to be an American, which we hear a lot of noise about lately, right? What's an all American point of view? Who's really an American? I have been asked several times why we don't have a tribal member doing the explaining about this history and the meaning of this day right now. But years ago, a friend pointed out to me that, well, not just me, but a bunch of us, that white people need to stop expecting Black, Indigenous, people of color to do all the heavy lifting involved in historic explanations and re-education, right? It's our turn, it's my turn to do that work of exploring and explaining. So here I am. When I was a kid, there were few, if any, history books that told the truth about the colonization of American and many other countries, right? We have access today to hundreds of resources that guide us through these like hidden histories that were left out of those childhood his school books and are still left out of some school books in some parts of the country to this day. Recently talked to a family that had moved here from Texas, and the kids claimed they did not know there were Indigenous people living anywhere in the United States. These were young tweens, and they had never learned that in school, and they didn't think it was true. Wow, right? We don't even know what's going on in some other parts of the country, um, or how the stories that are still being told, right? But we do have access to all these amazing resources, right? And some, I gotta say, make difficult reading and painful hearing, but others are really joyful and hopeful and encouraging and deeply moving. And so one of the things I think about is like doing it with somebody, going in with a buddy, right? When we explore the past and the present together, the way we have with like our social justice book study sessions with Stamped in the spring and Braiding Sweetgrass now, we can share both the discomfort and the delight, like the hope that we can do better and the willingness to like dig right in.
Of a book a minute ago that I will hold up again. This is actually the youth version, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, which was one of the books that I was looking at before B.I.
Mhm.
Reads picked up Stamped. And there's a thicker, more verbose version, and then maybe this is a easier way to start to explore this sort of stuff so that it doesn't become one of those books that you read the first 20 pages of and then say, yeah, I'm going to finish that later.
Well, and the cool thing about using the YA versions like that, like we did with Stamped, is that then you can have a family conversation with, several generations of your family. And honestly, you're right. Sometimes they're a lot more accessible and it's a good starting place. And if you really want to dig in, you go back and start reading the grown-up version, but or look at some of the resources that are cited in those books that are awesome too, right? I think that piece is something that's actually the fun part. We can respectfully and pleasurably observe this day and all this kind of day by exploring some of the history and culture, for instance, of our own neighbors, the people of the clear salt water and the Salish Sea, right?
I'm just
Um,
gonna, because you mentioned in this Indigenous peoples, there's like works cited,
right.
works cited,
Yeah.
works cited, works
Right.
cited, works
Exactly.
cited.
So if you want to spend, check out one a day for the rest of your life, you got a lot of going there. Um, but part of the point of that is to say this isn't just somebody's opinion. This is serious research that's been verified. And I think that piece is important too when we get into some of those conversations about, yeah, well, that's what your historian thinks, but my historian, right? We we've run into that before, have we not? And that's part of being human, right? Again, we don't always like to move forward. We don't like to give up our beloved myths, especially if they make us feel good. Um, but one thing I did want to say is that one our Braiding Sweetgrass book group is really a great way. And here's, the book, right? And there's still some copies at the front desk, right? Greed. I think we have a few
I
left.
see there's one today. So they've been trickling out.
I saw one in the library the other day too.
Okay.
Some people are bringing them back and putting them in the book exchange in our little library. And there's some at the public library as well. And we're going to have several more discussions. Our next one is going to be when? October 16th, right? And then on this, which Monday, October 16th, and it can be in person or online. And then Tuesday, October 16th, there's going to be an evening book discussion at the Bainbridge Library at 7 o'clock. And then, of course, we are having October 30th is another one for us, and we've got a couple in November. We're going to do one for each session and a wrap up, as we did with Stamped, and really talk about, so where did that leave us, or where do we want to take it from here?
So the library discussion in the evening is actually also on Monday, I believe. Check that.
Well, I don't know.
Maybe not. You said
this says Tuesday.
Tuesday the 17th. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Tuesday the 17th. Great.
That's all I know.
That's good.
But if you do join the book club, you can review our past the first couple sessions if you want to. But you don't have to have read the book. You don't have to have finished the book. You don't have to be caught up to where we are in the conversation, because one of the things we really see is like the overlapping themes are very, well, as she said, braided, right? It's braided themes that are repeated over in different ways that are so rich. So it doesn't really matter where you step in, you're going to find something really valuable to think about and take home with you. And some of it really, the publisher says at some point that their whole mission has been to create books that will change lives, because they believe that words can change lives. And I think this is a book that really has, this was a tiny, obscure press that had put out a handful of books and never sold more than a few hundred copies of any of them. And when this book sort of started off, I think it was 2013 or 14, I can't remember now, but it started off kind of slow, and then it became one of those cult things where everybody's handing it out and making all their friends read it. I got this battered copy given to me by my daughter-in-law, and it had the names in the front of like everyone who'd read it already. And it was like 25 young women, young farmers, young activists. It was awesome. I had to give it back. So then I started getting my own, but I kept giving those away. So it's one of those great books, to my mind, that really has thousands of gifts. You just, almost every single page has at least 5 things that I'm scribbling on. Yes, yes, this is so right. Anyway, that's a great place to start if you want to do that.
And one of the things that we've talked about related to Dr. Kimmerer's writing is that it is so inclusive. Yeah. It is welcoming, that it isn't as though this is a story of shame and guilt that cannot be, right. This is a stain that cannot be washed. This is an invitation to a new way to live, which is maybe not so new.
That isn't to say there aren't some challenging pieces, that things are kind of heartbreaking that you're going to read, but overall she's so hopeful, and she has done so much positive work and still continues to. And yeah, her writing is so beautiful too. She is she talk about a braid. She's like a scientist, a mother, a writer, a poet, and she's got all these strands to her own life that she brings to this material, and it's just amazing. One thing I would say too is she has a lot of podcasts and video interviews. If you just look up her name, you would find a whole lot of short things to listen to. And I found for some people who are like, yeah, I don't want to read that whole thing. I was like, well, here, watch one of these. And they watch it and go, oh my God, where's that book? Sounds amazing. They don't realize how powerful it is. And also, I tell some people, if you get intimidated, just open it at the middle. Because right, you don't have to read all the explanations. Just dive in somewhere. Look through one that speaks to you. Maybe it's about maple sugar, right? Jump in, and you'll find how much heart there is in these beautiful, beautiful essays. I did put a link, and Reed, you were going to maybe put that in the chat or something, right? For some of the podcasts that I thought were pretty awesome.
And Anne?
Yes.
This is Joan Burwell.
Yes.
Being from Montana, I want to say to you that there is an actual town called Sweetgrass, Montana. Mm-hmm. And it's by the border going up into Pincher Creek. I'm from, well, anyway, I just wanted to say that because it kind of tickles me when I got into that thing and it says sweetgrass, and that's what made me buy the book. I bought 3 of them already for presents. Goodbye.
That's awesome. You know, it's funny. Sweetgrass used to grow around here. It was native through most of the United States, or certainly, I don't know about the deep South, but certainly the northern tier and both coasts. And wherever native people were living, it was flourishing because it turns out to be one of those plants that needs the hand of man sometimes, or a hand of woman usually. That without division and without weeding and careful tending, it dies out. So one of the coolest things I discovered is there's a nursery called Prairie Nursery. I think I have the catalog here somewhere, where you can buy starts of sweetgrass and you can grow it in your own garden, or in my case, my pea patch. Prairie Nursery. This is the most beautiful catalog. Has fantastic advice for all kinds of soils. And interestingly, prairie plants are pretty well adapted to this part of the Northwest. Some of them need a little more water in the summer than others, but growing sweetgrass is a really neat way to sort of connect yourself to this beautiful tradition, right? Because it's used for so many things. And it's a sacred, holy grass, right? Used for smudging as well as braiding and other things. The other thing I wanted to kind of point out is that we have this great collection of videos from Suquamish elder and cultural historian Barbara Lawrence. And one of my favorites is her, I gotta say, truly astonishing story about the origin of the canoe journey, in which she played a really important part, despite being quite a young woman at the time. And there's this great part where she says, you know, at that time it was Booth Gardner was the governor, and he asked her to sit at this table in this conference with a bunch of white guys. And then at some point, as the plot thickened, he said, well, gosh, I guess we do need representative, but you can represent all the tribes, right? And, you know, the women. And she said, no. And Booth's wife, Jean, was really funny, said, you tell them, make them do it. And they brought in a bunch more people and got a lot more representation at the table. But she was like in her early 20s at that time. And I thought, wow, she's been gutsy her whole life. Barbara, I think you're muted.
Was that when Barbara Lawrence was invited to participate in planning the 100th year, the celebration of Washington's 100th year as a state? And
Right.
one thing that I remember her saying about that was,
Oh.
we have baskets older than that. And it just really reframed something for me. Like, you know, here we think, oh, we're celebrating all this stuff. And it's like, oh yeah, well, that's.
Well, another thing I remember about that was the state's idea was to have a tall ship reenactment of, you know, of the big ships coming in and the white colonists coming off the boats. And she said famously, as usual, that was not our best day, right? It's not a day we particularly want to celebrate, just saying. And everybody got really shocked and was like, oh, because again, you know, we buy our myths, right? And we have to be sometimes helped to get past the point of, you know, oblivion with some things like that. But that is one of her most powerful stories, I think. And also, I love the personal history she did for us about the first Suquamish Museum. And when I asked her about that, she said, oh, it's nothing. It'll take me 10 minutes to talk about that. Well, we talked for over an hour, and she told these great stories about all the things that happened that led to the development of that museum, how it outgrew its space, how it became what it is today, which is such a beautiful place. That piece is wonderful. And also there's that one about her father's story, about his being taken off as a very young child, 4 or 5 years old, and packed off to mission school, forbidden his language and forbidden his, you know, anything to do with his tribal history. And then going on to become a really important elder in his tribe and dying far too young. But that's a beautiful, beautiful story. And, you know, she's got a lot of great, yeah, I think Reed's putting them on there. And also, you know, of course, you can visit the Suquamish Museum, which has gorgeous artifacts and really beautiful storyboards. You want to allow yourself some time, because the walls are full of stories there. And there's a lot of history, not just in the objects, but in the narratives. And there's a little video that's really great too. That's like, what, 15 minutes or something, not very long. But it really puts you in a receptive space for hearing about these things. Also, there's one she did for us last year. I don't want to forget that, on Indigenous Peoples Day. That was fantastic, where she gave us music from contemporary Suquamish musicians and showed some art from contemporary artists and did songs and poetry, and had a great visit from one of her friends who not only is a singer songwriter who had some beautiful songs to share, but also was the Western head of the Bureau of Indian Health Affairs, right? And talked about how when the tribes got the first vaccinations for COVID ahead of everybody else, every tribe shared with all the teachers in the communities around them because they had enough to do that, which I thought that's so typical of this beautiful hospitality that's still amazingly a part of that culture. Also, and I think we're going to put that on the next Monday's email. So because we're closed on Monday, but if we put that link there for the Monday STTA, people can watch it and review it, because it was a fantastic program. If you missed it, or even if you saw it, it's really worth watching again. It's really
We're talking about the Indigenous artists one.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. That was so strong. And the music is, gorgeous. Also, one of my favorites is a program from Noel Purser, who explains how, as a teenager, she helped to rescue the Lushootseed language when her grandmother lost a lot of her memory and lost a lot of her language, and all she had was the language she had as a very young child, like toddler to 3 or 4 years old. And she was in a hospice situation, and the nurses didn't know what she was talking about. But Noel went in and recognized some of the words and said, "Oh, water, she's asking for water." And so she started recording what her grandmother said, and realizing she didn't know a lot of these words, and was able to connect with some of the other Salish elders up and down the coast and start reconstructing the language. And at that time, the Suquamish tribe wasn't really very big and didn't have a ton of resources the way they do. Well, they're sure well resourced now, but the tribe didn't feel like they could really take on taking this into the schools and stuff. So Noel, who was like 16, did it herself and started the first classes for students. And now it's taught in the schools, right? And anybody can take it. A lot of the elders who don't have all the language are taking it too and learning it. And there's even on the tribal website, there's a self-paced program for at-home learning for how to learn to read Lushootseed. And I was blown away. I was wearing this cool t-shirt that's from the Suquamish Pride event, and was at the Cups Coffee House, and somebody walked up and said, "Oh, you can read that." And he said what it said. And I was blown away. And it turns out he'd been studying the language on this website, and he actually didn't know what it meant, but he knew how to say it because the pronunciation was there. I thought that's so cool, right? So that is another awesome option if you're interested in languages, because one of the things you'll notice if you go down to the museum, or you go to Chief Seattle's grave, or you walk down to the Longhouse, is that a lot of the street signs are being put into Lushootseed, which is awesome too, right? Keeping it real. There's also a really cool overview of Puget Sound history on, I don't know if you've all found HistoryLink yet, but Washington State has this cool historylink.org. And you can look up everything from like revenuers and bootleg, what did they call it? Whiskey runners back in the day, to, very specific things, women's rights, civil rights, and definitely you can look at the tribal histories and all kinds of interesting things. It's a really great resource from Washington State government, and it's built on all the time, so things are added to it. It's really fun. Also, if you're a TV person, there is a series that's called The Culture Is. And recently, the Suquamish tribe put out a message that there is a really good one on The Culture Is Indigenous Women, and recommended that tribal people be watching it, and we can watch it too. A very moving program on Indigenous women. So if you look up, it's NBC, The Culture Is Indigenous Women. That's a great way to kind of sort of see what's going on, not just locally, but across the country, right? and I think we already talked a little about the Suquamish Museum as a good field trip, right? That's a great place to take guests and visitors. If you like jewelry, they have beautiful tribal jewelry made by tribal artists. I mean, and that, you know, that's a great way to support tribal artists is buy their stuff, right? It's the gift shop. Yeah, Reed's putting that info up on the chat right now. It's open 10 to 5 on Wednesday through Sunday, and Mondays and Tuesdays by appointment for tours and stuff like that. So that's another good one. Another piece that's really fun are the Port Madison dialogues, which we played in the spring, I think in March. There are 3 sessions of that were put together with the Kitsap. It's on the kitsapgov.com website, but it's called Port Madison Dialogues. And they were initially made a couple of years ago, and then the first 3 have been captured and posted, and you can watch. The first one's called Since Time Immemorial on Tribal History. The second one is Tribal Sovereignty and Governance, which is so interesting because a lot of people have no idea what tribal sovereignty actually is or involved, and what the tribal governance structure is. It's a great, really informative and well done. And the third one is Current Issues Facing the Tribe, which include, unfortunately, a lot of crazy stuff from neighbors, and the fact that they're still facing a lot of racism in Poulsbo and elsewhere. So there's that. Several people asked for more information about the Indian boarding schools, and they've certainly been in the news as more of the horrible mistreatment is revealed. Barbara Lawrence's talk about her dad does kind of discuss this, and Noel Purser mentions it in her Recapturing Lushootseed too, because kids were punished for speaking their tribal language. But if you want to know more, there's been recently a team of archaeologists and forensic anthropologists started working to return remains of children from Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania to their tribes. And they started this interactive digital map of Indian boarding schools that was recently launched by the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. So there's updates on there all the time about what's being done, reparations, some of the respectful reinterments and things like that are like following up with families and figuring out, making sure people get home. People who have been who died in the wrong place and were left there are being taken back to their ancestral homes, which is really comforting to a lot of people. Lena, do you want to say something?
Yeah, hold on. I'm trying to get my video back on. Just to add on to that little tidbit of the residential school, and I apologize. Here we go. Sorry. Oh God, I'm a hot mess too. Sorry, guys. This is just keeping it real. I get a hot mess today. So my grandma, Virgie Tabafunda, was taken from her family as a child and put in a residential school and lived there for many years. And when she came, well, fast forward to me talking to my dad about why we don't speak the native tongue like I hear across the bridge, my Suquamish kids that we're going back and forth playing with, and cousins and so forth. And there wasn't a lot of dialogue, discussion about it, but it was kind of the mentality of zip the lip back then. We don't talk about it. I don't know if that was even so much of shame as it was. I think grandma intentionally had her kids connect more with the Filipino side, and were raised more on the Filipino side when the Indopino community was growing and the kids are growing and families are growing. But we found a journal after grandma died that she had kept throughout those years of being in the residential schools and what she had learned. So when she had passed, we all made copies, and all of the family households got them. But I just find that interesting now that we're still learning how to process that, and how when the kids were taken away from their families, the native kids were taken away their families, how that cut the ties, and how drastic generationally that was, even down to me and my son, where I'm still learning on what to teach him, just from my own personal history, our own personal family history. We're still learning because there's a lot I don't even know myself, right? So I don't know who this is going to resonate with, if anybody, but just thought I'd throw that out there.
Oh, but that's a really good point. That, and we have shown Honor Thy Mother, the Indopino story put together by Gina Corpus in a small panel. And that seems like that's something we should show every year or two also, Reed, don't you think?
Mm.
We have been, we were given a copy of the first couple times we showed it. And I think that's something it's local history, but it's also international history. And it's also this big piece that, you know, so many people don't have any idea about. And it's really important to learn, you know, what happens to people when all these disruptions take place and how cultures can get shattered.
I do feel as though there's, you know, the work that Frank Kitamoto did and others on raising up the story of the exclusion of Japanese Americans. Those are stories that are painful and that they were so difficult that the generations that were immediately most affected were happy to put them behind them.
Mhm.
And yet the culture as a whole, we really lose out. And in fact, what Lena, what you were just saying, it's like the children of the people who are affected lose out on the learning because nobody wants to talk about it. And these other myths, whitewash stories in every sense of that word, are the ones that sort of carry on and erase everything that happened. And that's we're all the poorer for that.
Right, exactly. So thank you, Lena. Yeah, that's every story I've heard about kids taken away to these mission schools, they're all just completely heartbreaking. Like how inhumane, and done often in the name of, you know, religion, you think. No wonder liberation theology was such a release for the whole South and Central America, because it was such an, you know, the church had a very, very strong role. And a lot of times indigenous people have been Catholic, which kind of baffles me, but I get it too, because there were so many missionaries. Um, and the Catholics catechisms and stuff are pretty stringent about a lot of things. So having this opening has been really, really helpful, and it's still unfolding. I think we're still seeing changes in many of in many cultural views, I guess I want to say, or cultural stories, because we're starting to see more and more.
And
Yes, Joan.
I just recently read a book. What's the name of it? Oh, that went out of my head. But it was about the people taken off of the island here. Facing the Mountain is the name of it.
Yes.
It was so good. It was so detailed. It really blew my mind. Coming from the Midwest, I came from the West and then I went to the Midwest and now I'm back in the West. I just never realized all of this stuff, which is so beautiful to know, to learn. But anyhow, goodbye.
You know, Joan, you might want to listen. We recently took a group to the Japanese Exclusion Memorial, and we're so blessed to have Lily Kodama, Frank Kitamoto's sister, Lily, be our docent.
Yes.
And we recorded her stories, and that is a treasure to share.
Yes.
That is an amazing thing. Her stories are so, like, keeping it real, as Lena would say, down to earth.
I believe it, and let's keep it in front of us.
Oh, it's amazing. That's when I'm personally going to make sure that I listen to periodically. And, you know, she's not going to be around forever. That generation is
very true. Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, you're welcome. Sheila.
What's the name of the book, Joan, that you mentioned?
Facing the Mountain.
And Facing the Mountain. Oh, yes. Thank you. Yeah,
well,
fine.
That is good.
Yep.
Yeah. If you're into books, the library has an interesting collection, but you really want to be careful about some of the older books, like especially anything from the last century, because amazingly, quite a few are really racist and patronizing at best. There's one about Indianola that I just cringe reading it, that was written in the 60s and then supposedly updated not 20 years later or something, and it's still really noxious and horrible. But there are some valuable books, including one called Where the Language Lives, Vi Hilbert and the Gift of Lushootseed by Janet Yoder, which is a really beautiful documentation of the way that a lot of the Salish elders got together up and down the coast and put together their lost language word by word, sometimes from the handful of people who had the language or had some of the language. And Vi Hilbert was a really instrumental in making sure that Lushootseed was used and taught to kids and kept alive. So Janet Yoder is the author of that one, and it's in the library if you want to check it out. Another really interesting one is called Indigenous Mothers of Salish Coast Communities, by Candace Wellman. And she was trying to, I think she was working on her doctorate, trying to say, well, all these histories are about guys. Like, surely there were women. I mean, someone had them as children, right? Where were the moms? Where were the women? And in fact, all these people who were princesses and valuable trophies, where did they go? So she tried as best as she could to track. But she said, because of the way the culture was, the white culture especially was, recorded names are almost always the guys. And if there's mention of the women, it's not much. But she did what she could and tracked down families and took interviews and found as much as she could about some of the women who were really instrumental in shaping the West Coast culture as the white culture moved in. And that is a fascinating book too.
Yeah, it's no surprise or whatever that the name of the Indepino documentary is Honor Thy Mother.
Right? Because the mother was so often property, forgotten, not considered, well, I don't have to start on that one. Anyway, I have a very positive note to talk about a book that Barbara Lawrence recommended to me. Just came out this year. It's called Project 562, Changing the Way We See Native America. It was written by Matika Wilbur, a Salish tribal member, mother, photographer. And she spent 10 years traveling the country. This is that book. It's really big and really heavy. It's fantastic. So when she started this project, there was 562 tribes recognized by the federal government. But by the end of it, there was another dozen. So she included some of them. This book is fantastic. For one thing, it's drop dead beautiful. It's incredible. And I don't know if the library has it or not. It's a little spendy, but I feel like it's something, it's like, that was my birthday present for myself. And it's so worth every penny because it's an incredible story. Yeah, look, here she sold everything in her apartment. She left her kid with her mom and then took her kid with her part of the time, but traveled all around learning how to be not just a photographer, but learning how to do interviews, because she was kind of following in the footsteps of Curtis with his recording of the tribes, right? And she wanted to do an update, but in a lot of those Curtis photos, there's no name associated, especially of the women. And sometimes there's a tribal, it tells you what tribe they're from or where where the image came from, but it doesn't always. And so there's a lot of mysteries associated with those Edward Curtis, that collection. And so she is in updating it, did a lot more work capturing the characters and the what would you say, like the essence, I think, of some of these tribes and tribal members that are just gorgeous. She made a TED Talk partway through the first year of her project, and it's really cute. It was called Changing the Way We See Native Americans, Matika Wilbur, TEDx Teachers College. So she was speaking to a college. It's very short. It's like 19 minutes, but it was amazing. She showed a lot of these pictures, talked about the interviews, talked about her process, what she was learning. And at the end, she kneels down and does a prayer with cedar branches and asks the ancestors to forgive her if she forgot anything important or didn't know because she was ignorant and young, and asked for help. And it was so beautiful. I'm just like, oh my God, how gorgeous that was. So humble and lovely. But that's a beautiful way to kind of find out a little more about her work. I noticed that it said that site isn't active anymore, but you can get the book. Eagle Harbor Bookstore has it. And wow, is that a great gift for somebody? And it could be you. Barbara.
The name Matiko Wilbur rung a bell, and she's actually one of the people that does a podcast that's really worth a listen to.
Mm-hmm.
And that is called All My Relations. And it's fascinating, it's informative. They're pretty funny together. So it's definitely worth your while to check it out. I recommend it.
Yeah, I bet she is funny. She has a lot of warmth and humor in her writing. And she's super respectful. I don't mean that, but you can tell that she is young and sassy, right? In a way that's refreshing for a historian. Well, I hope I have given you some things to think about. Rita, did you want to say something?
During the Bainbridge Island Film Festival was this last weekend, and I got an opportunity to go, and there was one. Now, do you think I can remember the name? No, but it was about the Cherokee Nation, and they've discovered that there's only 2,000 speakers of it as a first language, and the work that they are doing, because they're doing schools, they're getting kids in, they're actually building a community where they're only speaking Cherokee so that they can get the language back into their culture. It was really amazing, and it makes me mad now that I can't find out what the name of the film was. Maybe it will come along, but it was done, and I didn't realize that it was so few.
I think there's a page in here about that, about the school and the teachers. There's like 20 things about Cherokee, but
right.
But there's a page in here about the immersion school and how the teachers make the kids really do everything in the language. And she said, if I know they know the word, I don't pay. If they try to use English, I can't hear them. But if they use it, I thank them. And it's like how to build vocabulary for kids, and it's pretty sweet.
Right. It was an amazing film, and I'll go back and see if I can figure out what the name of it is and where it was. Oh, Barbara.
It's on your screen right now.
Oh, thank you. There it is.
It's called Dadiwan
We will
Sini.
see. Oh,
yeah.
thank you. It's an awesome film. If you get a chance to see it, if it comes back through here or something for whatever reason, it's a pretty amazing film. I really enjoyed it.
Barbara had a question.
Yeah. So it was a comment. So sometime during the last year, BEMA did, their month-long programming, and a lot of it was about Indigenous films, filmmakers, and it was great. So keep your eye peeled for BEMA presentations, because they definitely include. They apparently have had a good link with the Suquamish tribe since the museum was founded. So it's just part of their mix, and they do a great job of presenting information.
And Barn too has had some really good programs with the like tribal drumming and dancing and things like that.
And so has PBS. Thank you.
Yes.
So I think we've shown that there are, pardon me, go ahead.
Barbara.
There's also a television channel that I can occasionally get on my non-cable connection called FNX, for First Nations Experience. And it's Indigenous focused programming, mostly in the US and Canada, but actually globally. And it was interesting. I can't get it anymore for reasons unknown to me. But I saw lots of interesting and informative things on it during COVID. So, yep.
I think if you poke around, there's amazing resources now that, we just didn't have before.
We've got a bunch of resources in this video, and just scratching the surface.